They believed they would dominate the skies forever, but ignored signs that were right in front of them from the very first day. What caused the fall of an air force that was, in many ways, far superior to the Allies? Is there a distinct turning point that rendered Germany's aerial arsenal powerless against the combined force of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union? Arrogance turned certainties into fatal breaches, and it was in that space that the downfall of one of the most feared air forces on the planet was born. Today, you'll understand how an empire that seemed invincible began to crumble from within even before facing its greatest enemies. Stay with me until the end and see how poorly calculated decisions, sabotaged by ego and poor strategic vision, paved the way for a turnaround that no one anticipated, forever altering the fate of the war. As we proceed, each detail will reveal a layer of growing tension, debunking myths and exposing errors that changed military history. But before we get to the decisive moment that turned the tide, we need to go back to the beginning and realize where the shine began to fade without anyone noticing. In 1933, as Germany prepared to rebuild its military power, a bold project began to take shape silently. The new Air Force emerged with gigantic ambitions, driven by the promise of reclaiming prestige and territory. The industry worked at a frantic pace, brilliant engineers presented technological advances, and the country believed it had found the perfect formula to dominate the skies. But behind the enthusiasm, a seed of disaster was already germinating. Strategic decisions shaped more by pride than by long-term vision. The story began to unfold like a clock ticking forward without anyone noticing how far behind it was. In the next block, you'll see how seemingly harmless choices became the first crack in a structure that seemed unbreakable, opening space for the first plot twist in this trajectory. The Luftwaffe grew too fast, too strong, and trusted too much in its own speed. The country celebrated each new plane produced as if victory were inevitable. But no one realized that the foundation of this expansion was built on distorted priorities. Technology advanced, but doctrine remained stuck in the past. The potential was immense, but the strategic vision was short-sighted. This explosive combination didn't show its immediate impact. On the contrary, it reinforced the illusion of invincibility. What seemed like strength was, in fact, the beginning of a great vulnerability. And when the war finally began, the eras of the past, once invisible, started to exact their toll in silence. In the next block, you'll discover why such a powerful air force ignored precisely the factor that could have saved. The expansion of the new air force seemed impeccable at first glance. The German industry broke production records year after year, showcasing fighters and bombers that impressed any foreign observer. The hangars pulsed like factories of a technological future, and the dizzying pace fueled the belief that Germany would be able to dictate the course of the war solely through air dominance. The problem was that, while these numbers grew, a fundamental ingredient wasn't keeping up: the ability to think beyond immediate borders. The country invested in speed, quick impact, and tactical strength, but completely ignored the need for strategic reach. This mismatch was born silently, almost imperceptibly, but it would be the first blow capable of compromising the entire structure built with so much pride. And further ahead, this error would return with double force, revealing that short-sighted vision would be its worst enemy. In the midst of this blind enthusiasm, a general saw what no one else did. He clearly perceived that, with enemies spread across entire continents, relying only on short-range bombers was like entering a dark room holding a candle while adversaries were already testing spotlights. He tried to convince his superiors that the future of aerial battles would require machines capable of hitting factories, supply routes, and vital centers far beyond the front line. But his predictions, despite being lucid, hit the wall of a command that believed wars would be won quickly before time turned challenges into insurmountable problems. The German strategic doctrine, so proud of its traditions, refused to look beyond the immediate horizon. The result of this refusal would be devastating, but no one at that moment was willing to admit it. The confidence was too great, and the ego even greater. While neighboring nations began developing aircraft capable of crossing oceans and attacking distant infrastructures, Germany doubled down on light and tactical models, reinforcing its dependence on short victories. It was like building an army prepared to run 100 meters while adversaries trained for marathons. This philosophical difference would only become visible when war truly engulfed Europe, and the country realized it couldn't interfere with enemy production lines or halt the rivals' technological advances. The error left behind in 1935 grew in the shadow of great German victories, waiting for the right moment to manifest. And that moment would arrive brutally, when the very fate of the Luftwaffe. He wasn't the type of leader who sought applause or symbols of personal grandeur. While others let themselves be seduced by the shine of newly designed machines, he observed the scenario with the coldness of someone who saw war as a calculation, not a spectacle. Walter Wever knew military logic deeply and understood that air power would only reach its maximum potential if it could strike the industrial heart of enemies, not just their advancing troops on the borders. For him, true victory wasn't in downing enemies on the battlefield, but in incapacitating their replacement capacity. It was a vision that bothered enthusiasts of immediate action, but it carried a sense of realism that few wanted to hear. However, despite his position and competence, his ideas began to clash with an environment dominated by haste and unbridled ambition. Unlike the traditional image of a rigid commander, Wever was the type of strategist who sought to understand the enemy before facing him. He studied maps with obsessive attention, analyzed logistical routes, and anticipated possible shifts in rival nations' production. For him, what was being built in the Soviet Union, especially in remote regions beyond the Urals, represented an impossible-to-ignore risk. He knew that if the war dragged on, these industrial centers would become inaccessible to German aircraft, which simply didn't have the range to reach them. His proposal to develop strategic bombers wasn't a whim, but an attempt to prevent Germany from entering a conflict it wouldn't have the means to sustain. It was a harsh but clear vision, and yet it found no echo among those who preferred to reap immediate results. The problem wasn't his lack of authority, but the resistance he faced in a command increasingly influenced by figures willing to shape the war to their own ego. Wever's warning sounded like pessimism to those who believed the conflict would be quick and devastating. The country was intoxicated by a sense of invincibility, and any voice suggesting caution was seen as an obstacle to progress. Thus, his doctrine began to be sidelined, not for lack of logic, but because it required time, investment, and humility, elements that were in short supply in that fervent environment. Fate, however, waited patiently, and very soon, an unexpected tragedy would remove Wever from the board at the moment when his presence was most necessary. Prepare yourself. In the next block, a sudden event will turn the Luftwaffe's trajectory upside down and pave the way for the most decisive error in its entire history. The tragedy happened without warning, as if fate had chosen the worst possible moment to cut the only thread still sustaining a strategic vision within the Luftwaffe. Wever, who had been waging a silent battle to convince the high command that the country needed to think beyond the next offensive, lost his life in an air accident that shocked the entire military structure. His absence wasn't just a human loss, it was the disappearance of the last break capable of containing the blind euphoria that dominated Berlin. In a few hours, everything he defended began to lose priority, as if the future had been left to its own devices. And in the vacuum left by his death, figures with less vision and more impulse gained ground, pushing the Luftwaffe exactly toward the path he tried to avoid. With Wever out of the picture, crucial decisions began to be made without the slightest consideration for long-term consequences. The debate over strategic bombers was simply abandoned, replaced by ideas guided by pride and the belief that the war would be won with quick and audacious actions. Influential leaders, driven more by vanity than rational calculation, began to impose their personal preferences on projects that required study and patience. And so, essential aircraft were sidelined while tactical models continued to receive absolute priority. What should have been a technical discussion turned into a status dispute, and the industry followed a course that seemed efficient only on paper but completely ignored the complexity of a global conflict. The death of a strategist became the birth of a historical error. The most impressive thing is that, during this period, clear opportunities to correct the course arose, but none were seized. Each new German victory seemed to reinforce the illusion that Weaver was wrong. The faster the country advanced, the more conviction the idea gained that there was no need to think about long wars. The command celebrated numbers, ignored alerts, and believed nothing could threaten the newly shaped military machine. Little did they know that this unmeasured confidence would be the trigger for a series of decisions that, added up, would lead the Luftwaffe to decline. And everything would start to become evident when the country entered its first major direct aerial confrontation, where for the first time, Germany would realize it didn't have the right tool for the type of battle it was about to face. In the next block, you'll see how the first major aerial defeat revealed the depth of the errors committed and how a single strategic detail exposed the fragility of the entire German structure. When the offensive turned against Britain, the Luftwaffe believed it would repeat the script that had worked perfectly in Poland, Norway, and France. Fast planes, concentrated attacks, and constant pressure had proven to be unbeatable weapons, until then. But upon crossing the English Channel, they encountered an enemy that was not only prepared, but knew the battlefield better than any German pilot. For the first time, Germany discovered that it depended on short-range machines to combat a force capable of defending its own home with frightening efficiency. The absence of strategic bombers, previously treated as a detail, now revealed itself as a monumental flaw. And in a few days, it became clear that what had started as a confident advance was turning into a confrontation for which the Germans simply had no answer. The situation worsened when a second problem came into play: the total lack of coordination with the German Navy. Instead of uniting forces to pressure Britain from all flanks, each military branch acted as if it were an independent organization, guided more by internal rivalry than by a common objective. The Navy requested aircraft capable of surveilling and attacking enemy ships, but the Luftwaffe treated these requests as insults. There was no cooperation, no dialogue, and every attempt at integration turned into a conflict. Meanwhile, on the other side of the sea, the British watched this mismatch with the same surprise as relief. Without adequate support, German submarines operated blindly, and surveillance planes were rare and improvised. Britain's greatest threat, the disruption of maritime routes, was not exploited as it could have been, and this omission had profound consequences. The impact of this lack of joint vision became evident with the emergence of a single German plane that, although limited, managed to show what could have happened if there had been real cooperation. The Focke-Wulf 200, even when used in insignificant numbers, sank ships with precision that frightened the British and caught the attention of Allied commanders. But the potential of this aircraft was never seriously explored. Instead of expanding it, perfecting it, or integrating it with submarines, the German command simply kept the project in a secondary role. It was like having the key to open the door to victory and deciding to set it aside. And as the days advanced, the Luftwaffe realized that its greatest fragility wasn't in the enemy, but in the inability of its own leaders to see beyond their own ego. Next, you'll see how the Soviet Union's entry into the conflict exposed an even deeper error, an error that would transform the lack of planning into an operational disaster. Want to continue? When Germany decided to advance on the Soviet Union, it believed it was repeating its winning formula: speed, surprise, and coordinated attacks. But the territory opening before it wasn't just vast, it was inhospitable, unpredictable, and cruel. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to operating near its own infrastructure, now found itself pushed hundreds of kilometers beyond its bases, where every logistical error multiplied like an endless echo. The lack of long-range bombers, previously an annoyance, now became a sentence. Damaged planes couldn't be repaired quickly, and movements consumed weeks. What was efficient in Western Europe turned into a labyrinth of delay, wear, and constant improvisation. With each new advance on the ground front, the Air Force lost a little more agility, and no one had foreseen how dramatic this loss would become. The Soviets, whom many imagined to be fragile and backward, proved prepared for a long war. Not only did they resist, but they relocated their factories to regions unreachable by German planes. While the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its own units running in improvised fields, the Soviets produced weapons and aircraft at a pace that seemed to defy logic. With each passing day, the front extended further, runways turned to mud, and winter began to approach like an invisible but relentless enemy. In this brutal scenario, Germany discovered that betting on a short war was more than optimism. It was a structural error. Every damaged plane that didn't return to combat, every part that didn't arrive on time, and every hour lost in transport revealed the real cost of the lack of strategic planning. The most surprising thing is that this collapse didn't happen with a big bang, but with a silent sequence of delays, failures, and improvisations. The Luftwaffe, once celebrated for its precision, now suffered from constant breakdowns, lack of maintenance, and complete disorganization in supply. Pilots flew in aircraft that shouldn't have been in the air. Mechanics worked without proper tools, and bases were hastily abandoned as the enemy advanced. For the first time, the German machine seemed vulnerable, exhausted, and unable to keep up with the pace of its own offensive. And it was precisely in this moment of fragility that a new twist would emerge, an event that would place Germany face to face with an enemy it should never have provoked. In the next block, you'll see how the United States' entry into the conflict turned an operational error into an irreversible abyss, and why this changed the Luftwaffe's fate forever. Want to continue? The United States' entry into the war changed the strategic landscape like a silent earthquake. Until that moment, the Luftwaffe could still mask its structural flaws with isolated victories, the courage of its pilots, and bold maneuvers. But with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the German declaration of war, the conflict ceased to be a European duel and turned into a global industrial clash. The U.S., protected by oceans and distant from enemy bombs, had the capacity to produce aircraft in volumes no country could match. In a few months, entire factories sprang up like new cities, operating day and night without interruption. For every German plane lost, the Americans produced several. What previously seemed like a logistical disadvantage now became an abyss. The Luftwaffe, already overburdened by the Eastern Front, entered a race it simply couldn't win. The difference wasn't just in quantity, but in how the Americans organized their production. While Germany got lost in contradictory decisions, discarded prototypes, and projects altered by impulsive orders, the U.S. followed a rigid, standardized, and efficient process. Each plane was built as part of a larger machine, where bureaucracy and planning worked together, not in conflict. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, suffered from sudden changes, constant political interference, and a chronic inability to prioritize what really mattered. The contrast became even more evident when improvised British models, like the famous wooden plane that no one would believe was effective, showed surprising performance and put even more pressure on the German command. While London found creative solutions, Berlin drowned in complexity. The impact of this new reality began to erode morale. Pilots who once trusted in German dominance were now sent into combat with fewer training hours, less reliable aircraft, and ever more enemies in the sky. The Luftwaffe no longer dictated the pace, it reacted, and it reacted late. The war that Hitler believed would end quickly turned into a battlefield where time worked against Germany in every way: industrial, operational, and human. And when the pressure reached its highest levels, a new figure emerged at the center of the chaos, someone who, despite his reputation as a combat ace, made errors that would amplify the disaster. The command was about to change hands, and with that change would come a sequence of decisions that would push the Luftwaffe even closer to collapse. In the next block, you'll meet the man who took technical control of the Luftwaffe and understand how his choices accelerated the fall of a force that seemed invincible. Wanna follow? When Ernst Udet took technical control of the Luftwaffe, many believed his experience as a legendary pilot from the First World War would bring a new phase of innovation. But it soon became clear that being a great aviator didn't mean being a great administrator. His fascination with certain ideas, especially dive bombing, began to distort priorities and drag the industry into choices that consumed resources without delivering real results. Essential projects were interrupted, resumed, and modified repeatedly as his enthusiasm changed. What was once an efficient production machine began to become a labyrinth of improvised decisions. With each new demand, engineers saw months of work discarded and replaced by instructions lacking technical coherence. The impact of these changes wasn't immediate, but accumulated silently, corroding Germany's ability to keep up with the Allies' pace. The case of the four-engine bomber illustrates this chaos in an almost symbolic way. A plane that should have represented the Luftwaffe's strategic advance became a set of absurd experiments imposed by Udet's personal taste. The model was forced to perform functions incompatible with its structure, resulting in problematic engines, constant failures, and subpar performance. Meanwhile, promising alternatives were sidelined or redefined countless times, always following decisions that ignored clear technical warnings. This sequence of errors turned what could have been Germany's salvation into yet another industrial monster difficult to maintain and almost useless on the battlefield. And while this was happening, the Allies perfected long-range aircraft that crossed the continent effortlessly, bombing the German industrial heart night after night. But perhaps the most striking symbol of this period was the development of the Me-210. Planned to replace a consecrated fighter, the new model entered production before it was even ready to fly. The result was an unstable, dangerous aircraft so full of problems that pilots feared taking off in it. Instead of being the promised evolution, the Me-210 represented the height of administrative recklessness. Years of work, precious resources, and hundreds of units produced ended up having to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Each error from this period not only delayed projects but also destroyed internal trust. The Luftwaffe was no longer the impeccable force of the war's beginning. It was an institution trying to correct flaws created by its own leadership. And in the midst of this turbulence, an aircraft capable of changing everything would finally emerge, but its fate would be sealed by the same indecision that accompanied this entire trajectory. Next, you'll see how the world's most advanced jet emerged as a promise of salvation, and how a political decision turned it into the Luftwaffe's. When the Me-262 appeared, it seemed the Luftwaffe had finally found the missing piece. A fighter so advanced, it seemed pulled from a future decade. Its clean lines, speed, and attack capability were so impressive that even veteran pilots were stunned upon seeing it for the first time. There was the chance to turn the tide against bombers that swept entire cities and against enemy escorts that had dominated the skies. But Germany was no longer the organized nation of the war's start. It was a pressured, fragmented country guided by political decisions that didn't align with reality. And it was exactly this mix of urgency and disorder that turned the greatest German technological trump card into yet another lost opportunity. Instead of being used as a pure fighter, the role for which it was designed and in which it was unbeatable, the Me-262 was forced to assume roles that compromised its performance and delayed its entry into service. While engineers tried to accelerate production, contradictory orders arrived every day. The plane needed to be modified, reinforced, adapted to carry bombs, reviewed, rethought. Each interference delayed weeks. Each change opened room for new problems. And all this happened while German cities burned under constant bombings, destroying factories, workshops, and training centers. Even when the Me-262 finally reached combat units, it was too late. Experienced pilots were lacking, parts were lacking, engines with reliable service life were lacking. The few jets that took off were pursued by enemy fighters waiting for their approach during slow and vulnerable landings. The plane was brilliant, the timing disastrous. The Luftwaffe presented its greatest advance precisely when it no longer had the structure to sustain it. The final drama came from the human factor. Young pilots, rushed with minimal training, were placed in machines that demanded precision and experience. Flight time, which at the war's start exceeded 200 hours, now barely reached 100, sometimes not even 50. The Luftwaffe was no longer a force composed of legendary aces, but of novices facing Allied veterans with numerical and technological advantage. No jet, no matter how revolutionary, could compensate for this inequality. And so, the Me-262, created to change the conflict's course, ended up becoming the saddest symbol of a war of late decisions. It represented what Germany could have been, but never managed to be. And it was only a matter of time until its shine faded along with the Luftwaffe itself. In the next block, you'll see how all these errors, strategic, logistical, and human, came together to form the definitive epitaph of the Luftwaffe, and why its collapse still echoes as a warning to the modern world. Want to follow to the end? The Luftwaffe began its trajectory as the ultimate symbol of the German military rebirth, but ended as a faithful portrait of everything a nation cannot ignore during a long war. Its collapse wasn't the result of a single error, but of a sequence of decisions that accumulated like misaligned gears inside a machine spinning too fast. It lacked strategic vision when there was still time to correct the course. It lacked coordination with its own allies and even with its own military branches. It lacked industrial planning, administrative discipline, and consistent investment in training. And when it finally realized the scenario had changed, it was already drowned by delays, inefficiency, and rivals advancing at an impossible-to-match pace. The technological shine that once impressed now served only as a bitter reminder of wasted potential. In the end, even the greatest advances, like the Me-262 and rocket projects, came to symbolize not victory, but desperation. Each revolutionary machine that emerged in the war's final years made clear the contrast between what Germany wished to achieve and what it could actually sustain. They were extraordinary weapons used by pilots too young, with too little fuel, and with a numerically dominant enemy on the horizon. The Luftwaffe had been shaped for a quick war, but was forced to face a long one. And for that reason, it collapsed not just on the technical field, but on the human one. Exhausted pilots, mechanics improvising parts, bases being abandoned, and a structure that no longer knew how to rise again. The final defeat didn't happen in a single day. It spread like cracks in glass until the whole set crumbled. And so, the Air Force that was once celebrated as the most modern on the planet ended its story as a silent warning to future generations. A reminder that technology without strategy is disguised fragility. Power without planning is illusion, and confidence without humility turns victories into traps. In the end, the Luftwaffe wrote its own epitaph by ignoring signs that were present from the first moment. Its fate wasn't sealed by enemies, but by choices made at home. And while the world rebuilt the skies after the war, the name of the Luftwaffe remained as an echo of a historical error, the error of believing that momentary strength replaces enduring vision. If you want the continuation of this series, scripts on other air forces, hidden battles, or unprecedented analyses of historical documents, subscribe now and activate notifications. There's a lot of history still to reveal, and you won't want to miss the next plot twists that the past hides.